Jane realized she was in big trouble as the sun began to set behind the distant hills. Her car had broken down, leaving her stranded on a desolate and unfamiliar road. She had no idea where she was or how she was going to get home. The road stretched out before her like an endless ribbon, disappearing into the distance. There were no signs of civilization, no buildings or houses in sight. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the occasional bird chirping. Jane felt a wave of unease wash over her. She was never easily scared, but something about this road felt off. She wondered if she'd missed a turn somewhere, but she couldn't recall seeing any other roads on her way here. She checked her phone, hoping for a signal or a GPS signal, but there was none. She couldn't call for help or even tell anyone where she was. She was stranded and completely alone. The light was quickly fading, and Jane realized she needed to find shelter as soon as possible. She looked around, looking for signs of life. There were no streetlights, no signs, and not even a mile marker to tell her where she was. Jane began walking down the road, hoping to come across some sign of civilization. The only thing she could see was the road, which seemed to go on forever. She began to feel as if she were walking in circles, with the same trees and bushes reappearing over and over. As she walked, her unease grew, and she began to hear strange noises in the distance. It sounded like laughter, or maybe whispers. She couldn't tell. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But as she walked further down the road, the sounds became louder and more distinct. She began to feel as if she was being watched, as if there were eyes on her from all sides. Her heart was racing in her chest as she quickened her pace. She finally saw a glimmer of light in the distance after what seemed like hours. It was faint, but it was there. She quickened her pace, her hope growing stronger with each step. As she got closer, she could see that it was a gas station. Even though it was a small, run-down petrol station, it was still a sign of civilization. Jane exhaled a sigh of relief and proceeded to the station. As she got closer, however, she realized that something was wrong. There was no one inside, and the lights were flickering. It appeared to have been abandoned for many years. A shiver ran down Jane's spine. She pondered whether she was still dreaming or had stumbled into a nightmare. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer on her way anywhere. She was on the wrong road. Jane stood outside the abandoned gas station, her heart racing in her chest. She was perplexed as to what had occurred here, why the petrol station had been abandoned, and why there was no sign of life around her. The silence was oppressive, and she felt as if she were the only person left on the planet. She tried to call out, but her voice was hoarse, and it echoed back at her from the empty building. She walked around the gas station, looking for any clues or signs of life. The place was run down and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The pumps were old and rusted, and the sign was faded and barely visible. As she circled the building, she noticed a set of stairs leading down to a basement. It was covered by a trapdoor, which looked old and weathered. Jane hesitated for a moment before pulling the door open, her curiosity getting the better of her. The basement was dark, and she couldn't see anything at first. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the space. The room was small, with old cans and debris littering the floor. She didn't see anything that could explain why the gas station had been abandoned. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small door in the basement's back corner. She could see a faint light coming from inside because it was partially open. Jane's curiosity got the best of her once more, and she cautiously approached the door. She slowly opened the door to reveal a small room filled with strange objects. There were old photographs, jars of preserved animals, and strange symbols carved into the walls. Jane felt a shiver down her spine and wondered who could have left all of this behind. She took a closer look and noticed a book on a small table in the corner of the room. It was leather-bound and had strange symbols etched into the cover. She took it up, the weight of the book in her hand. She couldn't make sense of the strange writings and symbols in the book. Jane felt a wave of dread wash over her as she turned the pages. She wondered what kind of person would have written such things. She was surprised to hear a noise coming from outside. It sounded like slow and deliberate footsteps. Jane's heart started racing, and she realized she had stayed too long. She quickly returned up the stairs, placing the book back on the table. As she walked out of the petrol station, she looked around to see where the noise had come from. But all she saw was the endless road and the darkening sky. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Jane knew she needed to get out of here, but she had no idea where to go. The road ahead seemed to go on forever, and she wondered how she was going to get back to civilization. She took a deep breath and started walking, hoping to find a way out before it was too late. Jane walked for what seemed like hours, her legs tiring and her stomach empty. The road in front of her seemed to go on forever, with no signs of life or civilization in sight. She wondered if she'd ever make it out of this desolate place. Jane's exhaustion caught up with her as the sun began to set. She stumbled and almost fell, landing on a nearby tree. She closed her eyes and leaned against the tree, trying to catch her breath. That's when she noticed it, a low growling sound coming from the bushes. Jane's heart beat faster as she turned her head slowly to see what was making the noise. From the darkness, a pair of glowing yellow eyes stared back at her, and she could hear the creature's heavy breathing. Jane froze, unsure what to do. She'd never seen anything like this before, and she was terrified of moving. The beast emerged from the bushes, revealing a large, snarling wolf. Jane's instincts told her to flee, but she knew she wouldn't be able to outrun a wolf. She slowly reached into her pocket, hoping to find something to repel the animal. Her fingers tightened around a small pocket knife, which she slowly drew. Jane knew she was in trouble when the wolf snarled, exposing its sharp teeth. As the wolf lunged at her, she took a deep breath and prepared to defend herself. Jane opened the pocket knife with a quick flick of her wrist and brandished it at the wolf. The creature paused for a moment, its gaze fixed on the blade. Jane stood there, knife in hand, facing the snarling wolf for what seemed like an eternity. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her hands were trembling with fear. The wolf then abruptly turned and fled into the darkness. Jane breathed a sigh of relief as she felt her legs give out beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jane realized she was in big trouble as she caught her breath. She was lost and alone, and she was being pursued by wild animals. She knew she had to get out of here as soon as possible. She stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes, and resumed her walk. She knew she had to keep moving even though the road ahead was dark and uncertain. She couldn't give up now, not with her life at stake. Jane walked, wondering what other horrors awaited her on the road to nowhere. She knew she had to be prepared for anything, and that her survival would be determined by her wits and courage. Jane trudged along the dusty road, her feet dragging. She felt as if she'd been walking for days, with no end in sight. The sun was beating down on her relentlessly, and she was starting to feel faint from the heat. Jane began to notice something odd as she walked. The road ahead of her was darkening and becoming more sinister. The trees along the road seemed to twist and contort, taking on strange shapes and sizes. Jane could feel a sense of foreboding creeping over her as the air became thick and heavy. She looked ahead and noticed that the road was narrowing, with trees closing in on either side. She had the sensation that she was walking through a tunnel with no way out. She became aware of a noise behind her. Her heart was racing as she spun around, but there was nothing there. She shook her head, berating herself for allowing her imagination to run wild. She then heard it again, a low, guttural growl. She spun around again, her eyes scanning the trees for any movement. That's when she noticed it, a pair of glowing, yellow eyes peering out of the darkness at her. She froze, her heart in her throat, as a massive shape emerged from the trees. It was a massive and imposing bear with midnight black fur. It stood on its hind legs, towering over her, its jaws open wide in a fierce growl. Jane tried to back up, but she got caught between the trees. She could feel the bear's hot breath on her face as it took a step forward. She closed her eyes and braced herself for the assault, but it never arrived. Instead, she heard a voice, deep and rumbling, like a bear growl. "You don't belong here," it declared. Jane's heart was pounding as she opened her eyes. The bear had vanished, and she was once again alone. She looked around, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. She resumed her walk, her mind racing with questions. What was this strange location, and why was it so strange? And who was the person who spoke to her? She began to experience a strange sense of déjà vu as she walked. She had the impression that she had been here before, in this dark, twisted forest. She couldn't recall how or why, but the sensation was palpable. She kept going, her curiosity getting the best of her. She needed to understand what was going on in this strange and twisted world, and she needed to get out before it was too late. Jane could hear whispers in the wind as she walked, faint, ghostly voices calling out to her. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but their eerie, otherworldly tone made her shiver. She was walking along when she heard a loud rustling in the bushes ahead of her. As a figure emerged from the shadows, she froze, her heart racing. It was a woman in a flowing white gown that seemed to glow in the dim forest light. Her hair was long and dark, and her eyes were piercing blue, as if they were staring right through Jane. The woman spoke softly and soothingly. "Don't be afraid," she advised. "I'm here to assist you." Jane felt an odd sense of peace wash over her. Something about this woman felt familiar to her, as if she had known her for years. "What exactly is this location?" Jane inquired, her voice trembling. The lady smiled softly. "This is the way to nowhere," she declared. "A wandering place for lost souls." Jane's heart dropped. "Am I completely lost?" The lady nodded. Yes, you can, however, find a way out. All you have to do is keep walking. The woman then vanished, leaving Jane alone in the forest once more. Jane inhaled deeply and continued on her journey. The trees loomed over her like grotesque giants as the forest grew darker and more twisted. She felt as if she were in a nightmare, where reality's rules had been twisted and distorted beyond recognition. Jane began to notice strange shapes moving in the shadows as she walked. Twisted, malformed creatures that appeared to be made of darkness itself. They stared at her, their twisted limbs reaching out to grab her. Jane attempted to run, but her feet seemed to become stuck. She was entrapped, surrounded by creatures of the forest. The creatures scattered when she heard a loud roar. Jane looked up to see a huge, imposing figure standing in front of her. It was a lion, with a golden mane like the sun. Jane could feel the power emanating from its eyes, which glowed with a fierce intensity. The lion spoke, its voice rumbling and deep. It said, "You are not alone. I will guard you." The lion then vanished, leaving Jane alone once more. But she felt stronger and more resilient now. She knew she could face whatever lay ahead on the road to nowhere with courage and determination. And she knew she'd find a way out no matter what. She'd seen strange and terrifying things on her journey thus far, but she felt she was getting closer to the end of the road, whatever that might be. As she walked, she noticed a light in the distance, flickering like a beacon of hope in the darkness. She accelerated her pace, eager to find the source of the light. As she approached, she noticed a small cabin nestled in a clearing among the trees. The warm glow of the fire spilled out through the windows as smoke rose from the chimney. Jane paused, unsure whether to approach the cabin. But something drew her to it, a sense of safety and comfort she desperately needed. She approached the door and tentatively knocked. She pushed the door open and stepped inside when there was no response. The cabin was small and cozy, with a roaring fire and a simple wooden table set with a few bowls and spoons. There was no one there, but Jane had the impression that someone had visited recently. She sat at the table and heard a soft whisper in her ear. She turned around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was no response, but the whispering went on, becoming louder and more urgent. Jane felt a wave of panic wash over her, as if the cabin's walls were closing in on her. She rose to her feet, ready to flee, when she noticed a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a woman in a long, flowing gown that glistened in the firelight. Her hair was golden, and her eyes were a dark, hypnotic green. "What is your name?" Jane inquired, barely above a whisper. The lady smiled warmly. "My name is Sophia," she introduced herself. "I am the keeper of this cabin." Jane experienced a wave of relief wash over her. "I've been on the road to nowhere," she explained. "I have no idea where to go or what to do." Sophia nodded in agreement. "I know," she admitted, "but you must have faith in yourself. You'll have the answers you seek." Sophia then vanished, leaving Jane alone once more. But Jane felt different this time, more confident and certain of herself. She knew she had a long journey ahead of her, but she also knew she had the strength and courage to face whatever awaited her. And she knew she'd eventually make it out of the road to nowhere and into the light. Jane continued down the road to nowhere, feeling more confident and empowered than she had ever felt. She had survived countless horrors and overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and she was confident that she could face whatever lay ahead. She noticed the landscape changing as she walked. The trees were becoming fewer in number, and the ground beneath her feet was changing from dirt to hard, rocky terrain. As she approached a rocky outcropping that loomed ominously in front of her, she felt a sense of foreboding. As she got closer, she noticed a narrow path leading up the side of the rock face. Jane paused for a moment, unsure whether she should take the path or continue down the road. But she knew she had to face whatever lay ahead, so she started climbing. Jane had to use all of her strength and agility to make her way up the treacherous and steep path. But she was tenacious, and she persisted, driven by a sense of purpose and determination. As she approached the top of the rock face, she was startled by a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere above her. When she looked up, she noticed a pair of glowing eyes looking down at her from the ledge of the rock. She froze, unsure what to do, when a massive creature leapt down from the top of the rock face, landing with a thunderous crash on the path in front of her. It was a wolf, but not like any other wolf Jane had ever seen. Its fur was as black as night, and its eyes glowed in the darkness like hot coals. It clenched its teeth and let out another terrifying growl. Jane was well aware that she was in grave danger, but she refused to give in. Her heart pounded with fear and adrenaline as she stood her ground. Jane dodged out of the way as the wolf lunged at her, narrowly avoiding its snapping jaws. She realized she needed to defend herself, so she looked around for a weapon. She noticed a large rock nearby and picked it up, intending to use it as a makeshift weapon. Jane stood her ground as the wolf circled her, snarling and snapping. She knew she had to fight for her life, so she swung the rock as hard as she could, striking the wolf in the side. When the wolf yelped in pain, Jane took advantage of the opportunity to flee. She dashed down the path, her heart racing, until she was certain she was safe. As she caught her breath, she realized she had come further than she had ever imagined. She had faced her fears and triumphed, and she knew she was up for whatever lay ahead on the road to nowhere. Jane continued down the road to nowhere, her heart pounding from her encounter with the ferocious black wolf. She knew she couldn't relax her guard, not even for a second, because danger seemed to lurk around every corner. As she walked, she noticed that the air was becoming colder and that a thick mist was rising from the surrounding hills. Jane shivered as she tightened her jacket around her, a sense of unease creeping into her bones. She continued walking, the mist thickening with each step. She could barely see her own hand in front of her face before stumbling down the road, relying on her instincts to guide her. She felt a sharp pain in her foot, as if she had stepped on a shard of glass. Looking down to see what had caused her pain, she was horrified to see a bony hand reaching up from beneath the mist, its fingers curling around her ankle. She tried to pull away, but the hand was surprisingly powerful, dragging her down into the mist. Jane kicked and thrashed in an attempt to break free, but the hand would not let go. Jane saw more and more skeletal hands reaching up from beneath the ground, clawing at her clothes and grabbing at her limbs as she was pulled deeper into the mist. She screamed in terror as she realized she was in grave danger. A bright light pierced the mist, illuminating the skeletal hands and making them shrink away in fear. Jane squinted, trying to figure out where the light was coming from, when she heard a familiar voice call her name. It was the old man from the petrol station, clutching a torch. He had been following her the entire time, keeping a safe distance between them. Jane felt a wave of relief wash over her, and stumbled towards the old man, collapsing into his arms. He held her close, his gruff voice soothing her as he whispered words of comfort. Jane regained her composure after a few moments, and she looked up at the old man, her eyes full of question. "What are those hands?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man sighed, his eyes sad. "Those are the hands of the lost souls, my dear," he explained. "They are the ones who have been consumed by the darkness of this road and who now reach out to anyone who dares to walk it." Jane felt a shiver run down her spine, and she knew she had to keep going, no matter how dangerous the journey was. She thanked the old man for his assistance, and resumed her journey down the road to nowhere, her heart filled with a renewed sense of determination. She knew she had to keep going, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, because she was the only one who could reveal the secrets of this dark and perilous road. So, if you can relate to my story, please do like, share, subscribe, and press the bell icon to get the latest notification.